Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Interrupting Unconscious Bias to Create High-Performing Teams. My name is Stephanie Hurst and I'm the Member Programs Manager here at the National Apartment Association. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I do want to go over a few housekeeping points. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on NAA's website next week. During the presentation, you can type your questions into the chat box on your screen and we'll share them with our presenter. We've left time at the end for questions. And now I will turn the microphone over to NAA's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee Chair, Marcy French. Marcy.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending today for another amazing DE&I webinar hosted by NAA's DE&I Committee. I'm super excited to introduce today's speaker. She's been doing a lot of work with our diversity leadership program, and the participants have been raving about the impact she has had on each of them. Erica McMullen is the founder and CEO of Moxie Consulting Group, LLC, trusted by a variety of industries nationwide. As a result of Erica's contributions, organizations have been named as America's Best Employers for Diversity by Forbes magazine, as well as being listed best in class in their respective industries. She is a humanistic leader, organizational consultant, facilitator, and speaker. Erica's passion is empowering leaders to create diverse, high-power, high-performing teams, develop leadership, and leverage the benefits of inclusion. She uses her 20-plus years of experience to shift thinking from problems to possibilities and help clients operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion into their organizations. Erica is a graduate of George Washington University and Florida International University. She resides in Virginia with her husband and 3 children. Without further ado, Erica.
Thank you so much, Marcy. And it's so good to see all of you joining, all of the names. Hello, everybody. As Marcy said, feel free to ask questions. And there'll be times I'm going to ask you questions in the chat. And so we're going to start pretty quickly using the chat. It might be a fast and furious chat, and that's okay with me. Before we get started into that, though, I always like to set ground rules. This is one way that I model inclusion and psychological safety in my workshops. And I invite you to use some of the same language in the teams that you are a part of. My goal today is that we have a productive atmosphere where we learn from each other, that we have an honest dialogue about bias, about inclusion, about the topics that we're having. That means being honest with yourself and using I statements so that you're saying, wow, I struggle with this. That we're going to do this with dignity and respect, and we're going to use oops and ouch as the model that we use as we work through kind of conflict. The reason I use that is when people raise their hand and say, I'm offended, you know what happens? Everybody shuts down, the entire room, the energy switches, and so we all get defensive and we go to battle. But if you say something and you realize after you say it, now this is not the webinar where you'll be saying something, but again, I'm giving you a tool as we start off. You say oops and you restate it. If you say something and you recognize, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just said that, or I can't believe it came out that way, or I didn't mean it like that. That means you take accountability for your words and your actions, because you know that intent and impact are 2 different things. You might have an intent, but the impact that you have with other people is more important than your intent. And so you have to be responsible for that. And then ouch is what you say if you hear something, you're on a team and you're like, oh my gosh, ooh, whoa, okay. That's offensive, that's a trigger, that is not what we should be saying. Call an ouch. You can state publicly why that's an ouch, or you can tell that person one-on-one why that's an ouch, right? This decision that you make depends on the situation, but it is important as we're working through inclusion and diversity and bias to have those conversations. It requires that you show up and be brave and courageous, which I know all of you are going to do, because all of my interactions with NAA, people show up every day to be courageous and brave in this work. So thank you. We have a lot to cover. I'm hoping to get through all of this, okay? And we will do that. We'll be talking about bias and defining it, talking about the types of bias, the risks of bias, how to foster inclusion and how to mitigate bias, because I want to give you some practical tools to take away from this. There'll be further resources from myself and NAA, as well as Q&A at the end. All right. So I'm going to show you a slide, and what I'm going to ask you to do in the chat is, the first thing is say, what is there for you? That's what I want to know. Like, what are you seeing? I want you to tell me what you think the intended message of this is. And then I want you to tell me, how do you think this message is received by you, potentially by other people? All right, so hopefully everyone, you're on your keyboards or your phone or your iPad or whatever you're using, and you're ready to start going in chat. Okay. This is what I'm sharing with you. Okay, and this was on Twitter a couple years ago. So I'm going to go to chat. Tell me what is there for you. What do you think the intended message is? And how do you think that message is being received? I cannot believe nobody is in chat. Hello, you're typing now. Thank you. Yes, Darlene. So I see a future for the two on the left, and for people of color, nothing, right? Kara, I think the message is meant to be about possibility, but all I'm getting on the Black pictured participants is their identity, not potential. Absolutely, right? Yes. Yeah, it's a bit condescending. That's a good word, Tracy. Thank you. Oh, and then Vanessa, you're bringing up social status. Yes. Thank you. Right, Jody? Kind of in your face, white women have a future and people of color no future. So this particular ad was on Twitter. Now, what's surprising is that I actually thought this was like fake because it's so egregious in its bias. I was like, this can't be real, but it is real, unfortunately. This was in 2019, as you can see, Mizzou NCA or NCAA inclusion. So this was a campaign for college athletes to talk about inclusion and to show athletes of diverse backgrounds. And when this ad made it out to Twitter, it was pretty clear within a few minutes of hitting the Twitterverse. People were like, whoa, hold on here. Like, what is going on? And right, Shar, this, Tracy, I'm telling you, yes, this was real. So this is actually the date and time. I took the screenshot of it, so you have it. 10/23/2019. Okay. Dana, absolutely, right? Diversity without equity, without inclusion or equity. And it actually shows you, right, kind of some other statements. And it's not like they were any better, because you see another individual who appears African-American to me, Chad Jones Hicks. And then we have another statement about equality, but nothing from Chelsea, who we know wants to be a future doctor, and also from CJ, who wants to be a future corporate financier. Some people have asked me and said, well, do they ask the same questions of every candidate? How could this happen? I'm going to look down because I'm going to read to you exactly the comment that Ariel Mack gave when she was interviewed by the individuals at Mizzou. And she said, I am an African-American woman, sister, daughter, volunteer, and future physical therapist. So it's pretty clear that there was a huge amount of bias that led to really these unjust and discriminatory kind of statements, that we only saw white college athletes with a future after college, and we only saw our Black college athletes stating certain, things about race or diversity. And it was very in your face about it. They again came out with the wonderful tweet that we apologize, and then made a video. I saw the video back in 2019. Honestly, it was horrible, and it just created more outrage. And this was after 4 years of the University of Missouri really attempting to increase their inclusion and diversity of individuals on campus after they fired one of their college presidents. So, and I know I see like Shay with the wow, and so Shay, they did not choose the captions, right? So I think that became evident. They gave all the information, but whoever edited this, or whoever posted it, edited it in a way that their bias just leaked, right, all over it. Because you are correct, Shay, this is how the Black athletes are seen, just as Black individuals, right? Like just Black. They're not seen as athletes, as having a future, as having a career, as studying anything at University of Missouri. You're college athletes. Okay. So my question to you, why does this continue to happen? Why do you think this continues to happen? What is at play that This gets posted on Twitter. How many deaths, how many reviews does this get? And it just gets posted. So we have, they don't know any better, blind spots, ignorance, right? Bias, limited diversity on marketing teams and leadership. Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Right? Doesn't sound like there's any diversity in the editing or the review board, lack of education, right? Oh gosh, I love that, Shay. Until we get to know people for who they are versus what we assume about people. Absolutely. So why are we talking about this? Because this continues to happen. Because we are unable to see our blind spots, because we need people in the room to raise their hand to speak up. If those people are not in the room, right, then all of this bias just continues. So thank you so much for participating kind of just in this first exercise and for such thoughtful comments in the chat. You all are spot on in that lack of self-awareness. I see that, Tracy. One of the potential biases I think that could have occurred here was groupthink, which is a bias. It's called the bandwagon effect. And some of the reasons for groupthink is exactly what you put in the chat. Sometimes it's structural, which means that within the team structurally, the diversity is not there, whether it's racial, ethnic diversity, language diversity, cognitive diversity, gender diversity. People bring their life experiences with them and their perspectives. So if the room is filled and it's homogeneous, there's a huge blind spot and nobody can see it, right? The other structural reason might be that there's hierarchy that occurs and it shuts people down. Sometimes you have a very dominating or narcissistic leader that doesn't want to hear viewpoints from other people, and they insulate themselves and they don't allow outside or different viewpoints to come in. And this is why it's so important to form your teams with diversity in mind, knowing that without diversity, you increase your risk to blind spots. You increase your risk for all of these type of activities to occur that are unjust and discriminatory. Some teams suffer from a high amount of cohesion. Some teams say, you know what, I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm not going to say anything. On the other side of that, I see a lot of apathy, right? People just get so exhausted and so burnt out sometimes and are just like, I don't know. I'm just not even going to say anything anymore. And the other one is stress. We know that biases surface when we are stressed, when we have limited amount of time, when there's pressure, when we're having a bad day, because we default right back to our blind spots and back to what it is that we know. Okay. Some of the symptoms of this is that self-censorship. Okay, sometimes we just don't say what's different from the group, even if we do know it. And a lot of times they're what we call mind guards to protect from disagreeable information. This is why people are so defensive, right? Or people don't allow other perspectives to be heard. I love, Shay, you put in there, people are afraid of the unknown, right? That's why people are so protective about these different things. What I want you to know about implicit bias is that it's universal. We all have implicit bias. It is a part of how our brain functions, and it really makes us make really quick judgments and assessments of people and of situations without us realizing it. Now, that is the key to implicit bias. We didn't even realize it. Okay, that's very different than explicit bias, which is there, which is overt, which is in your face. And I think nowadays, unfortunately, some people hide explicit bias within implicit bias, right? We know that those are two different things. So I'm not going to pretend that those are the same. They are not the same. Even though we have implicit bias and all of us have it, it is important that we take responsibility and ownership for our bias. A lot of people say, well, I don't have bias, or I don't see color, or I'm a good person, Erica. I hear that like every day and twice on Friday in the work that I do. So we'll talk about the whole good person thing. What I want you to know from kind of a neuroscientist perspective, which I am not, so I'm going to stay in a short lane here, is that science tells us that we're much more robotic than we think, and that our prefrontal neocortex is really small. And because of that, it relies on automatic functions, meaning that our brain likes shortcuts. It's hardwired. It needs to be a prediction machine. It seeks the simplest path to any conclusion. And because we are filled with our past experiences, because we are also inundated from society with messages that are stereotyped, that are biased, and that are discriminatory, it seeps in. I don't care how good of a person you are. I don't care how much it's not your intent. Unless you spend time intentionally including people, you will unintentionally exclude people. You have to almost fight against it because of all of the information and the pieces of information that are coming to us daily. There's so much of it. And that also makes us fall into bias more because our brains are overloaded by all of the information. And again, our brains are seeking the simplest way and an automatic way to make assumptions and decisions and conclusions. There are hundreds of biases out there. I am not going to list all of them or even think you're going to remember all of them. Here's a few common biases. What I really want to kind of hone in on is understanding really when bias shows up, right? What does that look like? The first group of biases that show up is when we need to act quickly. A lot of times, we don't prefer it, but we need to. And when that occurs, many times it's just too much information. There's not enough meaning. We don't know what we need to remember. We don't know what information is important, and bias comes in and helps us. The second group of biases is when we prefer people and things that we're familiar with. We are all like that. Oh my gosh, you went to the same school, you look like me, you live in the same neighborhood, all of those identity group memberships, we have an immediate kind of fondness or bond towards. The third is that we search for evidence to back up our feelings, our perspective, and our initial assessment. We all like to be right. Let's be real, we do, right? We love to be right. And so a lot of times this is when people start doubling down, right? And they get really defensive and because we don't want to lose. And bias comes up from that as well. And I see Tracy Pena, I see your question. Are biases formed out of personal experiences? Yeah, so bias in and of itself is kind of neutral. And so I'm glad that you brought that up because great question. And it is formed from the different experiences that we have. We then form bias into something that's positive or negative. We usually talk about bias as just something that is against something else, but you have to remember bias kind of goes three ways. It can be positive, it can be negative, or it can be neutral, meaning that I might have a bias against certain things, certain people, certain groups, but I might also have biases that automatically favor ways of doing things and groups of people and languages and genders, etc. It's important for you to become really it's important for you to become really clear of all of your biases. I'm very aware of my biases, and in any given day when I'm surprised and I kind of go, oh, I check my biases because 100% of the time there was a bias there. So I remember I was emailing back and forth with somebody named Tiffany. I met Tiffany on Zoom, and Tiffany turned out to be a Black woman. And I went in my own head, in that minute of seeing the camera go on, I went, oh, to myself, not out loud. And I went, oh my gosh, I had a bias that based on her name, I thought she was a white woman. Or asking somebody something and they say something and I went, I'm surprised by that. What bias did I have that led me to the assumption of why I was surprised? So if you want to get a really quick way of figuring out what are your biases, figure out when you're surprised by something. You start to figure out what you are favoring and what you are unfavoring, or what your assumptions are about people, because those are the same assumptions that then we get upset when people make those assumptions about us, right? So like, oh, I made an assumption you were married, I'm sorry, right? I automatically made that assumption. I automatically made the assumption that you were, straight. I realize I make that assumption all the time, right? That's a bias or an assumption that I have, okay? It is impossible to be completely biased. So most people will say to me, well, then if it's impossible, why are we even doing this? Like, what's the point? We all have it. Who really cares? Move on, right? We're going to talk about why it's so absolutely important. Now, we're going to talk about this good person, bad person. So who am I and who are you, right? I want everybody to know this is not about being a good person or bad person. We all have bias. So if we all have bias, we need to take the accountability to know what our biases are and then take the next step to mitigate our biases. If it's like one thing I could put out in the world is to stop this whole like, but I'm a good person and I had a good intent. I get it. We all did. Now own it. You have to then move into owning it. You have to get out of your own feelings enough to care more about the impact that you're having with other people. Okay. And just recognizing then too, how bias may have shown up for you, right? And how that changes then how you behave. So for me, years ago, for instance, I would never have shown up to this webinar with my curly hair, ever. You never saw me have my natural curly hair because I spent so many years assimilating into culture to be included in the workplace that I completely forgot, like, how can I show up and just be me in my natural curly hair? And I identify as Black and Hispanic, I identify as Afro-Latina. It took me like 5 to 7 years to get my curls back because I had relaxed my hair for so long in order to feel included in the dominant culture that told me I only value you and your you know, kind of your professional skills and what you can do in the workplace if you have, right, straight hair, which is what you see in the picture. So frankly, now I show up however I feel like showing up for the day, right? Whether I felt like blow drying and flat ironing my hair for the week or whether I have my hair curly, and I feel 100% comfortable and confident in that. But I was not in that place for many years because of so much bias and discrimination for women of color and what their hair means and the comments about it. And I unfortunately got one of those comments and I did not have the wherewithal to stand up to that. And then after that, I was like, okay, I guess I'm never showing up to work with my curly hair because it's like, what did you do? And not in a good way, right? It's like, what happened? It's so crazy. That was the comment. And I knew at that point, I'm like, oh, not good. And by the way, they have much better hair products now. Can I just like be so excited about that? I'm just saying, like, so excited about that. Anyway, so we're moving on from hair because we can have a whole other webinar on hair. But okay. Yeah, so happy for the hair industry on that. What we need to know is that we see the world differently. People, how I experience the world based on my personal experiences and how you've experienced the world based on your personal experiences. And we have to recognize there is value in seeing the world differently. We have to be able to leverage the power of diversity and turn that power into advantages and turn that power into amazing things for your organization and stop seeing it as such a negative, right? And stop seeing it as bad and good. You're crazy for that. You're bad for that. In order to really do this work, you have to come to the place of understanding and openness and being curious and valuing other people for that difference, accepting it and celebrating it, not tolerating it. I never want to hear the word like, can we be more tolerant? Nobody wants to be tolerated. Nobody wants to be tolerated. Really think about that word. I'll tolerate you because you wear glasses. I'll tolerate you because you are a person with a disability. I'll tolerate you because you're a white woman, a Black woman, a Latina. No one wants to be tolerated. People want to feel valued and accepted for who they are, like period. So take tolerate out of your vocabulary if you're using it, okay? Do not use it from this day forward. And don't use the word sensitive either from this day forward regarding this work unless it's absolutely something specific. Yeah, me too, Darlene. So why does bias matter? Okay, I know you all already have an idea just based on that Twitter Mizzou ad about why bias matters, but I want to give you just a little bit of some recent kind of business case, right, for what's happening. I want you to think about your neighbors. You all are in the rental housing industry. Think about, you know, neighbors and the properties that you have, neighbors that are next to you and what our world is looking for. I mean, what our world is looking like. We know we have increasing immigrant populations. And what's interesting is if you look at this, some of the recent data, it's showing that our Asian immigrant population is going to be getting bigger and bigger and actually outnumber our Hispanic population. So that is something that you should know. Asians are expected to be the largest immigrant group by 2055. And the reason for that is because Asians have some of the world's largest working age population. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of mobility and a lot of migration with that. If you're curious as to where those countries are, oops, sorry, my slides are, there we go. The top 5 Asian countries are China, India, Vietnam, Philippines, and Korea, where we will be increasing our number of immigrants from. So if you want to think about 8 areas that you should study on cultural competency, this would be one of them. Why that's important here in the US is because we know our older population is going to outnumber children for the first time in history. So if we think about, part of my background's in healthcare, so the word that comes to my mind is geriatrics, but I recognize for some people that might feel insulting, so I apologize. I guess our senior citizens are older adults. I kind of think about it from a specialty perspective. And by 2030, all of our baby boomers will be over the age of 65. You think about rental housing, assisted living, so many of our affordable senior housing is going to make sure that it's also accessible, right? So be thinking about that from a business perspective and about diversity. That is absolutely important. When we look on the other spectrum and we go into pediatrics, right, we know that it was estimated by 2020 that over 49% of children will be a race other than white, non-Hispanic. What we have seen is that biracial category, that multiracial category for children, for pediatrics, increase. So we know, right, 10 years from now, the world is going to be much more diverse with our younger generation. And we know about 22% of our US citizens speak a language other than in English. So they speak English and something else. And so thinking about, wow, we are living in a very multicultural world as well. So why bias is so important is because if we are going to be interacting with many individuals who are different than we are, we have to make sure that we are keeping our biases in check. Okay? Bias leads to exclusion, inequality, inequity, and discrimination. And that's really an important connection to have, because many people kind of think like, well, the bias, it's unintentional because we're unaware of it. So it's not like, a really big deal. No, bias absolutely can lead to these other forms, and not only then discrimination, but then you get all the other, what I call like isms, right? Racism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it really does impact our decisions. It impacts our actions. And I'm going to get more into how it impacts our decisions. Okay. Before I move into that, are there any questions, Marcy, that I have not addressed?
We have, I think, 2 so far. I answered, Becky, your question in writing there. All this will be reported and on the NAA website. One person asked, what was the reason, she thinks she missed it, what was the reason for the connection between stress and bias?
Yes. Okay, so the connection between stress and bias is that when we are stressed, right, and our brain is flooded, and whether the stress is I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm afraid, or I'm having a bad day, right, just kind of negative emotion, bias increases. And the reason it increases is because our brain is looking for the shortcut, right? It's like a bandwidth. Your brain is always like on this bandwidth, right? And so, when you wake up and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed. I can't adult today. Bias is just like flooding all of your decisions. Okay, so recognizing when you are stressed, bias is going to increase, which means you need to slow down. Okay, really good question. Wow, thank you.
One more. I think how do you help employees who may have had this happen to them and help them to know they are in a safe space? That question came up while you were talking about hair, and I'm not sure if it was intended specific to that, but that was how the question was.
That's good. And I love your curly hair too, Marcy. We both are rocking the curly hair.
Same. I've had a lot of blowouts for the websites. Don't do it anymore.
Right? Isn't it freeing? I know we're having a side, but it is like, I used to spend it could take 2 hours. I mean, 2 hours. Because when I blow dry it now, it's like double the size. I have a lot of shrinkage. It's like down to here.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I'm thinking 2 hours, so many hours of my life just gone. Anyways, I think that becomes a question in twofold, meaning I feel like from a personal one-on-one, right? It's having that conversation with the person, listening and being there. If you're not of the same race or ethnicity, it doesn't have to be like, I understand what you're going through. It can just be like, I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. And hold space for that person to share their feelings. If it's more so from an organizational, like HR perspective, then it does require, I think, that the organization look at their policies. We have many states now that are passing the Crown Act, so you can Google that, CROWN, and look into that, and making sure that there aren't inequitable or discriminatory policies regarding dress code or hair within your practices or policies, because frankly, there are still a lot of them. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to the next section. I will pause again, by the way, to ask if there's any questions, so you can keep them coming. And I do try and look at like chat intermittently as I can. So let's talk about your specific industry. And I so appreciate the last comment that I read from Cara, and I hope I'm saying your name right, Cara House, just about the use of neighbors, because you're right, I started using that term because if not, I really do think we get into like us versus them. No, like we are all on this planet together. And, you know, my environmental clients that I have, like no one has identified another planet yet to go live on, right? We know we have Bezos and we have who else is going out into space. They're not reaching any other planet. This is it. And so we do have to find a way to recognize that we are in this together and that we need to coexist with each other in more than one way. So let's continue to talk about what are the risks of bias to the rental housing industry. I did a quick Google search, right? Just like put rental housing. I did rental housing and I did news, and this is what came up. And then I did rental housing, and then I think it was diversity. Now I can't remember, so I apologize. And I took just the first three and I did a screenshot, and I did this last night. I think I did it last night, so it would be recent. And I scroll down, there is so much happening in the rental housing industry. Frankly, it is really overwhelming. And so I have a lot of empathy for those of you that are doing this day in, day out, everything from, you know, making sure that properties are staying profitable with everything that's occurred with the pandemic and rent. We have areas where people are buying up homes and turning them into rental. We have rental housing affordability issues. We have discrimination issues. So there's a lot going on within rental housing, and there are many risks for your organization when it comes to discrimination. This was a recent study that was done. It just came out in December 2021, and it's still a working paper with some economists. And what they found is that renters who identify as Black or Hispanic experience discrimination in almost every major American city. Not all, but they did about, I think it was about 50, you know, when you look at like metropolitan statistical areas and tracts, it is an amazing study. It is very well done. The research paper is like 40 something pages. And I know we can put the links in the chat for that if you're interested in getting it. So let's look at what the results of this study is. Has anybody read this study, looked at this study, or anybody, as far as your organizations, have they talked about this study that came up recently? I'm curious if any of your industry people have looked at it. NAA just put the article from Vox in the chat if you're interested in it. So here's what the study found. They did like a bot, like a robot, and they went and filled in all of these hundreds of inquiries to property managers for rental housing. And they had certain names that they used. So they had names that were white, perceived to be white sounding names like Aubrey. They had Black sounding names. They also had Hispanic sounding names. And so, you know, whether that was like, and I looked at the list and I'm trying to be accurate. So it was like Mariana was one of the Hispanic names, Isabella, and then Black sounding names. It was like Daquan, I can't remember all the rest. And they had first name and last name. Again, all that detail is in there. What they found is that the difference for Black sounding names versus white sounding names were that it was 5.6 percentage points lower for Black sounding names to get a response. So that means that the white sounding names got a 5.6% higher response, right? You can kind of read this both ways. The Hispanic sounding names compared to white names received 2.8 percentage points lower, right, responses. So whites compared to Hispanics, whites received 2.8% more responses. Now let's look at specific markets. So I don't know, people, I saw someone said they were in Seattle, people are in different places. Maybe if anyone's in California, let me know. Anybody in Kentucky, let me know. Anybody in Florida, let me know. You'll be interested in this. The strongest discrimination for Black sounding names was in Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, California, and Louisville, Kentucky. And the strongest discrimination for Hispanic sounding names was in Louisville, Kentucky, Houston, Texas, and Providence, Rhode Island. Okay. Yeah. Now, there were markets where the Black sounding names and Hispanic sounding names actually received more responses. For Black sounding names, they received more responses in Jacksonville, Florida, and Columbus, Ohio. And they also received, for Hispanic sounding names, more responses in Sacramento, California, and Tampa, Florida. So the researchers have a couple hypotheses from this, and that is perhaps these particular areas, Jacksonville, Columbus, have a larger population of Black individuals to begin with. So the rental housing industry kind of has less discrimination just because they're more populous. They were also looking at some of that data to see if it was just like a statistical anomaly, which I'll have to kind of go back and read some of the final pieces of the data to see where they net out, because it is a working paper, which means they haven't finished the final analysis for publication yet. Needless to say, this is really impactful data. And the reason it's so impactful is because of this final sentence I'm going to put up. Is they found that researchers found that a non-response to an inquiry from a perceived Black or Hispanic renter lowers the probability that a renter of color would ultimately inhabit a given property by 17.3%. So what we're showing in this study is correlation. So when we say, why does it matter? Because if the bias starts at your name, and we know we've seen the studies of this when it comes to applying for a job, the impact of that means that I have a least likely chance to actually live in this property. That is direct correlation of bias to decision-making, okay? What are the risks to talent management? Now, I know these type of studies are much more prevalent. I'm gonna give you a quick example of one, just again, to connect the dots. And this was a study that was done out of Yale, and they decided, you know what, we all know we have bias, number one. Number two, we're going to pick a group that we know is trained to be objective. And that group is science faculty. They're trained in like the investigative process, right? If you remember this from back in like high school or middle school, you trace the facts back. And they said they're one of the most objectively trained kind of faculty members. We're going to create a position, lab manager. We're going to create one curriculum vitae, a CV, and it's going to be exact. One's going to say Jennifer, one's going to say John. These were the names they used. They sent it out to over 125 research intensive universities in the United States. And they said, we're curious to see, considering they're the most trained in being objective, how are they going to make decisions, right? Based on the candidate. What are we going to see? Are we going to see equal rates of wanting to hire John and Jennifer? Do you think we saw equal rates, people? Where are my folks at? Did we see equal rates of wanting to hire? No, no, we did not. Okay. Who do they want to hire more often? John or Jennifer? Yep. There are more John CEOs than there are female CEOs in the Fortune 500. It's another fascinating statistics, right? Anyway, so our science faculty members were more likely to say that John was qualified, more likely to hire John. And the last two really get me. They were more likely to invest their time to develop and mentor John, because John was such an outstanding candidate that if he came to this university, they were like, oh my gosh, I would totally want to mentor John, develop him. And the last one, they were willing to pay John more money in a starting salary. How much more in thousands per year were they willing to pay John? How many thousands of dollars more a year? Drop it in chat. Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't double digits. Well, fortunately, you know what? Good thing it wasn't double digits, because it would mean a larger inequity. It was $4,000 more a year. However, when you look at this from talent management and you expand it out, what this means, right, is from an equity and inclusion standpoint, Jennifer and John are not going to have pay equity, because every year that John gets his merit raise, he's starting off with $4,000 more, right? That absolutely makes a difference. Absolutely makes a difference. And if John is willing to be developed, then think about that. Who's getting a promotion first, John or Jennifer? John, exactly. The inequity of promotion and advancement. So all of this absolutely creates inequitable workplaces. So when people say, well, we have equality, or we have the same number of men and the same number of women, you don't have equity. So these small little things, we're like, well, it was only 4,000, or well, no, it absolutely makes a difference. Because then when you look at organizations and you say, well, I don't understand why all the leaders are men, it starts with John and Jennifer. Okay, so remember that. It starts with John and Jennifer. If you think John is more qualified and more competent, it starts right there, okay? So what are the risks to team effectiveness? So now we're going to get into the high performing teams, and I'm going to give you some kind of takeaways, all right? In research and in industry, we all talk about, oh, we need to have great teamwork and we need to have good communication. All of these things are absolutely true. What I want you to know is something that we don't talk about too much. That is the fact that the more diversity you bring onto a team, whether that's racial, ethnic, language, sexual orientation, disabilities, family status, cognitive diversity, you are not going to automatically get the benefits of inclusion. We so want that to be true, but that is not the case. You are going to first get increased friction. So does that make sense? You're going to get increased friction. If you are a skilled manager in inclusion and cultural competency, you will be able to leverage that diversity for the benefit, right? And get the benefits of diversity and leverage that friction. If you are not, you are only going to have friction. Friction means you have an increase in mistrust, negative outcomes, backstabbing, people not trusting each other. That's the piece of this work that people skip. They automatically think, we're just going to increase diversity, just go get diverse people, and then it's going to be magic. No, it's not. You have to increase your skill set to be able to manage that and get the benefits. That's what inclusion is. So that's why diversity is one thing, inclusion is something separate. You can have all the diversity you want in an organization and not have inclusion, and not have cohesion, and not have collaboration, and not have communication. You have to be able to create that atmosphere for people to be successful and productive and feel included and show up. Okay. So Project Aristotle did highly effective teams. Google threw in tons of money to figure this out. And what they came up with is teams who are highly effective, right? High performing teams have good communication. They admit when they do not know something. They call out conflict, and they're psychologically safe. That is so important, because these are like the foundation for inclusive teams. That's why they're highly effective. You have to have inclusion. You can have the diversity, but if you don't have inclusion, you're not getting the benefits, okay? Another research article that came out from Harvard Business Review said that the best problem-solving teams were diverse. They leveraged the different thinking, and they were psychologically safe. Again, components of inclusion, being able to leverage the different thinking and be psychologically safe. Psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. I love this final quote. It can be destroyed in an instant with an ill-timed sigh. So people say, well, I didn't say anything. I'm like, oh my gosh, but your face said everything, right? You rolled your eyes, you sighed, you looked like you didn't care. You told me everything you needed to say without opening your mouth, okay? Psychological safety is absolutely critical. So remember, you have to have inclusion to enable all the benefits of diversity that people espouse and talk about. It is a requirement, okay? So I'm going to leave you with ways that you can foster inclusion and ways that you can foster psychological safety and mitigate bias. And then I'm going to take questions after that, Marcy, and we'll see kind of where we're at. The questions that you need to start asking, right, when you're working on a team or you're getting together on a team, and typically we just go straight to the task. Ooh, hold on a second. The task is absolutely essential. I get it, especially when we have to do things. But if you're going to be on like a long-standing intact team and you want to have psychological safety and inclusion, you need to figure out what's at stake or risk for your group. What can you count on each other for? And what do you need to do differently to achieve the reputation and fulfill that purpose? One of the most impactful and high-performing teams I worked on sat me down when I joined and said, listen, we can have all the disagreement and positive disagreement, meaning we want to have different viewpoints. We want you to challenge. We want all of that. And we do that in the safety of this conference room. When we leave this conference room, we are one team and we are intact. When we go out and we present, we are not saying nasty things about each other. We're not gossiping. We are one united team in this department. Changed how everybody functioned. It is so important to stop for that moment and really get clear on how you are going to work together. Another thing is being cognizant of status and power dynamics, depending on how hierarchical your organization is. If you are a person that holds a leadership role, how can you start chipping away at some of that? How do you become accessible as a leader? How do you invite people, right, in, and doing that in a way that's authentic? Also being mindful of cultural norms. Maybe you need to invite that person in one-on-one because they don't want to speak out loud, right, in front of a group. Admitting when you don't know is important as well, because we're all so afraid of admitting that. We all want to be perfectionists. We all want to all the time be competent, right? And be perceived that way. Questions that you can ask is, what might be missing? How can I help you? What can I do to help you? What are your concerns? What are you up against that I'm unaware of? What workarounds are you frequently doing if there's like process issues or constant problems within a particular department? How can we be more inclusive? People will give you the answers to these questions if you show up in a manner that you want to be receptive to the answer. If you show up and you're like, so, I mean, what are we missing here? You've just shut everybody down. So again, how you say things is really important, but these are very, very powerful questions. One study I'll share with you is there's many different models to inclusive workplaces. This is just one model. But really these 6 kind of pillars of an inclusive workplace, if you want to, I think these components are solid, is that there's psychological and physical safety. People need to feel safe. That the work group models belongingness, that you feel involved, that you feel respected and valued, that you feel like you can contribute your ideas, that you're part of the team to decision making, that there's an authenticity, right? That there's not this sense of fakeness, that you can share who you are and show up, right, authentically with your curly hair, and that there is a feeling that there's equitable treatment, and that there's a feeling like the organization, they're seeing it, wants to recognize and honor and advance diversity. Within these 6 pillars of inclusive leader and practices, kind of breaking that down, what can you do? If you are working on a team, make sure that team is diverse. Ask people to fully contribute. Get in meetings with people, have one-on-ones. This is really important as we're working more remotely. Scheduling 10, 15 minutes on a Zoom, on a Teams. You need to be more intentional about that, again, if you're working more on a hybrid or remote. Supporting individuals, mentoring, coaching, developing people, also espousing and ensuring that there's justice and equity and that there's shared decision-making. The reason these are important is because the diversity and being able to fully contribute speak to people's uniqueness, that you value my uniqueness and who I am. And the other components speak to belonging. What the research has shown with inclusion is that there's 2 dynamics at play. People want to feel that they're included, and they want to feel that they value uniqueness, and they also want to feel like there's a sense of belonging. If you don't have those, right, you don't necessarily have full inclusion. Like, I felt a sense of belonging in an organization, but I didn't feel they valued me for my uniqueness, right? So there was assimilation there, okay? So remember, you need to explore your biases, interrupt bias, understand that there's multiple perspectives and perception out there. That is a superpower nowadays. If you are a person that can see that there are different perceptions and perspectives, even if you don't agree with the person, but you can say, wow, I can see they're doing this because they're scared, or I can see this is of value to them, even though I don't agree with it. That is a superpower. That allows you to stop being defensive. And also you need to spend time connecting with your out groups. So what I mean by out groups is that with bias research, we know that there are in groups that we have affinity for, and there's out groups, right? Who are those groups of individuals that you don't connect with at all? Who are those identity groups? How can you start connecting with those individuals? Research has shown when we humanize people in groups that we don't understand, it changes us. It changes our beliefs, it changes our biases, it changes how we interact with people. So get out there and authentically connect with people who are different than you. It really strips away all your assumptions about people. And then finally, how can we mitigate bias? On an organizational level, and I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly, is that if you are working on the organizational level, it really is about getting a baseline as to where your organization is, and then embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion, looking at your data, looking at your policies. One example here is, this particular D&I dashboard by Cummings. They put all their data out there publicly. They know everything about their aggregated employee base, where they live, what their generations are, race, ethnicity, language, etc. And it's phenomenal because you have to first know where you are and then be able to move forward into transformational change. If you're part of a group or a team, like I said, get to know your team members, assign roles. What I mean by that is if the team that was working on the NCAA inclusion ad assigned roles and had a diverse team and said, I want you to be a challenger. I specifically assign you with challenging this. I specifically assign you to help me find the blind spots. What am I missing? It would have been a completely different outcome. Ask for feedback, listen to the feedback. Recognize power dynamics again. Active listening is really important. Summarize what you're hearing. Discuss bias in the decision making. And if you're created those group norms, that gives you the ability to discuss the bias. And then you can kind of say, use oops and ouch, or say I'm having bias, or let's reflect on the impact of that, or let's pause, whatever your statement is. But you have to set that up in advance so people can hear it and not shut down and go like all defensive. Okay. And then if you're an individual, research has shown motivation makes a difference. So if you really want to get to know your biases and you're motivated to do that, you will start to recognize what they are, slowing down, really becoming more self-aware. I talked about when you're surprised to check your biases and just be curious. Don't keep making assumptions about people and make yourself uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable is not the same as safety. Because when people say, oh, I thought we were going to create a safe circle. I'm like, but just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean, right, that you're not safe. Those are two different concepts. And name bias and call bias out. That is absolutely critical to do. Okay. I want you to think about what is the one thing you're going to do and change or start or stop today. I'm always, interested in knowing what that is for people, so you can put that in chat. And there are a whole bunch of resources. I'm going to just kind of flip through them, and then I'm turning this over to Marcy and to Stephanie. I'm going to put all these links, by the way, in chat. So if you're interested in any of these, any free trainings on bias, I'll put that in chat. And then books, I love to recommend books. And now there's audiobooks to everything. So these are some great books if you've not read any books on bias. Okay. And more books. There's lots of good books. If you're interested in behavioral design to debias kind of systems, these are two books by Dr. Iris Bonet. I think she had like a first edition and second edition here. And books on psychological safety. The three best authors, hands down on it, Amy Edmondson, Timothy Clark, and Daniel Radicke. That is my contact information if you want to reach out to me. And I'm done.
Erica, we have a couple of questions I want to get to.
Okay.
The one person asked, the dashboard that you showed, was it available to the entire team?
And that dashboard is publicly, I got it off the internet. It is publicly available to everybody. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. One anonymous question came through. How do we get our leaders to understand the importance of not being biased? Same for our HR department. I feel we have let some people down in our company due to this.
Yeah, I think really, and I say this because I have a love-hate relationship with the business case. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, we should just get it. But I really do. Yeah, I do. I have a love-hate relationship, but I think it really is giving them some type of business case to rationally latch onto, so that they are aware of why it is so important.
That's great. And then the last one I have here is, have you ever looked at the implicit bias project? I believe the person referred to the Harvard implicit bias study.
Yes, I have. And I will put that in chat as well.
And everybody, just a reminder, this has been recorded and will be available on NAA's website if you need to go back and review. I know I'm going to. There's a lot of great nuggets in here that I want to take away.
Excellent. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, Erica. Stephanie?
Yep. Erica, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, sharing all of your resources. And if it's okay with you, Erica, I will just share these slides so everyone can have those that was on the call today. All right, so before we close, I just want to share a few NAA updates. Next week, NAA will be partnering with the National Council for Mental Wellbeing to present a 4-part webinar series for rental housing professionals. So join us to learn strategies to manage and combat stress, trauma, and burnout while coping and building resilience. You can check out this page for the webinar details and the links to register. Next slide. And starting next Monday, May 2nd, we'll be accepting applications for the Alexandra Jackie Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Scholarship and the Innovation in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Grant. You can check out this link for more information on these programs, and the deadline to apply for both opportunities is July 29th. And next slide. Our next DE&I webinar will be on Thursday, May 12th at 2 p.m. DE&I strategy, how it will attract and retain your employees. You can grab that link to register. And next slide.
And that seems like a great one to continue building the business case for HR. I was like, that's the next one I would go to. So whoever asked that question, I would attend that, because that is exactly what you need to present to your HR, because that's what is important to them, is attracting and retaining employees. That's what keeps them up at night.
All right, and lastly, we do have additional DE&I courses on NAA's online learning platform, Visto. You can check out this link for more information, or you can head to gowithvisto.org and find diversity and inclusion under the catalog section at the top. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us today. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you. And actually, you know what? I will drop those links in the chat. I just realized I did not do that. So I'm going to just do that really quick if anybody wants them. So I was catching up to chat.